going to be talking about lessons in allyship from Israel, Palestine. My name is Steve Slocum. I'm the founder of Salam. We do work in the San Diego area, advocacy work, and I'm joined by our Director of Education, Deirdre Encarnacion. She's going to be giving us a very enlightening presentation on the parallels to Native American experience. And then, of course, I mentioned my friend Gabriel, who's helping us with tech stuff. We're going to talk about 4 important topics in this arena: terms and distinctions. I'm going to give a quick pitch on the historical context. Deirdre is going to talk to us about parallels to Native American experience, and then we're going to close with suggestions for advocacy. Before we begin, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement, which I'll just read, and you can feel free to read along and ponder these words. For millennia, the Kumeyaay people have been a part of this land. This land has nourished, healed, protected, and embraced them for many generations in a relationship of balance and harmony. We acknowledge that we are now living on these lands. We acknowledge that these lands were taken from the Kumeyaay by force at great loss of life. We also acknowledge that making this statement is only a baby step towards justice and equity for the Kumeyaay people. We pledge to learn about the colonization of these lands, to listen to the stories of the Kumeyaay people, and to do our part to establish reparations and bring about an equitable society for the Kumeyaay and all Native peoples everywhere. So just a little bit about us. We've been doing advocacy work here in San Diego area since 2019. We developed a critical awareness, critical activation program that is designed specifically for people of privilege to equip and deploy them, us, as social justice allies. And we are about divesting from privilege and doing our part to dismantle systems of inequity. So allyship, what is allyship? In general, allyship is those who are not marginalized, standing in solidarity with those that are. Here at Salam, we are learning by doing. We just kind of jumped into this arena and are learning by trying, and we're also learning by listening. We've decomposed this allyship world into 3 kind of tiers. The first being awareness, awareness of the lived experience of others in societal injustice, because people of color are asking us to do our homework and learn about these things from generally available sources before we start showing up in their spaces, which can sometimes be hurtful. We've also learned that as important as awareness is, it's not enough. Human-to-human connection is what gets deep into us, into our hearts, and motivates us when we start feeling empathy, hearing the stories of a friend, and motivates us to act. And that gets us to the 3rd level of acting in solidarity to support the dismantling of systems of injustice. So we have much to learn about what's taking place in Israel, Palestine, and the people who are involved in that now, as far as our own advocacy work right here in the San Diego area. Okay, so we're going to begin with terms and distinctions. We're going to talk about 4 important terms: anti-Semitism, Zionism, anti-Zionism, and Jewishness itself. Anti-Semitism is discrimination, targeting, violence, and dehumanizing stereotypes directed at Jews because they are Jewish. And this is taken directly from Jewish Voice for Peace website. Anti-Semitism is a form of racism and focuses on ethnicity and perhaps culture. The same definition may be used, substituting different terms and different people for Blacks, Asians, or whoever. Zionism. Now, I'm going to define Zionism, but this isn't me. These are excerpts from a book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, written by Jewish historian Ilan Pappé. And it comes from chapter 2, which is titled The Drive for an Exclusively Jewish State. I'm just going to read these bullets. Zionism emerged in the late 1880s in Central and Eastern Europe as a national revival movement prompted by the growing pressure on Jews in these regions to either assimilate totally or risk continuing persecution. By the beginning of the 20th century, most of the leaders of the Zionist movement associated this national revival with the colonization of Palestine. They actually had considered several other areas, but settled on Palestine. To bring their project to fruition, the Zionist thinkers claimed the biblical territory and recreated, indeed reinvented it as the cradle of their new nationalist movement. As they saw it, Palestine was occupied by strangers and had to be repossessed. So Zionism secularized and nationalized Judaism. This is why today several streams of ultra-Orthodox Jews are either non or anti-Zionist. The Zionist project could only be realized through the creation in Palestine of a purely Jewish state, both as a safe haven for Jews from persecution and a cradle for a new Jewish nationalism. And such a state had to be exclusively Jewish, not only in its socio-political structure, but also in its ethnic composition. So that being Zionism being defined, what is anti-Zionism? This comes directly, again, from Jewish Voice for Peace. Being an anti-Zionist, and keep in mind, this is in contrast to anti-Semitism. We're talking about anti-Zionism. Being an anti-Zionist means opposing the political ideology of Zionism, which resulted in the expulsion of 750,000 indigenous Palestinians from their land and homes. It means standing against the creation of a nation state with exclusive rights for Jews above others on the land. Anti-Zionism supports liberation and justice for the Palestinian people, including their right to return to their homes and lands. Anti-Zionists believe in a future where all people on the land live in freedom, safety, and equality. And finally, on these terms and distinctions, just some thoughts about Jewishness itself. Is Jewishness an ethnicity? Is Jewishness a religious identity? Or is it a national identity? I'm not sure there is any other group of people with this level of complexity in the intersection between the facets of identities. And of course, the main complicating factor is what we just talked about related to Zionism in terms of having an actual nation for a given ethnicity. I'm not going to attempt to decompose or explain it, but I just wanted to throw this out there because I have found it helpful to identify which facet of Jewish identity is showing up in different situations. For instance, and I've had this happen more than once, of having, say, a rabbi challenge me in my work of advocacy for Palestinians. So it makes me stop and think which identity is showing up in that situation. Okay, so now let's dive into the historical context of Palestinian loss of land. We're going to start this kind of in the middle of the story, and that's in the late 1800s to 1947. Um, so at that period of time, what's in the box on the left, the bullets there kind of define what was going on at that time. The Zionist movement, which we talked about, was beginning in Europe, and at the same time in Palestine, at that particular time, there were only 40,000 Jews in Palestine who were living in peace with their neighbors. I actually had a conversation with a Palestinian person just yesterday, and we're gonna hear from her. But she told me that at that time, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, which were her very grandparents, her Palestinian grandparents, they would literally just drop off their kids at each other's houses, and they just peacefully coexisted, taking care of each other's children when the parents had to go do something. So it was a very peaceful coexistence at that time. It was also in that time under the Ottoman Empire, which was Turkish, and it was a part of the kind of declining Muslim empire. And that ended at the end of World War I in 1918. And a whole new governmental system came to be at that point with the end of the Ottoman Empire, and the British Mandate period came into place. And this was basically 100,000 British troops occupying Palestine and being the force of governance until such time as the Palestinians were able to govern for themselves. And this was happening not just in Palestine, but in the surrounding Middle Eastern countries as well. But of course, things happened a little differently in this region. So this was a massive change for the people of Palestine from living under Muslim Ottoman Empire governance to going to occupation by the British. Also during that time, between the late 1800s and where we stop it at 1947, there were over 500,000 European Jews under the Zionist banner were emigrating from Europe into Palestine. And we see that in the picture on the left, in the small pockets of white there, where we see that we have gone, you can show the next slide, from 40,000 Jews living in Palestine to over 10 times that. And they had begun to, you can show the next slide. They had begun to exploit the land ownership laws and begin to just develop these settlements. And in that process, many Palestinians were being displaced already at that time. So this slide shows the original two-state solution put forth by the UN in 1947. Now, the UN had only been in existence for a year and a half when this was happening. So it was just a fledgling organization. A lot led up to this. So let me set the stage. Because of the land grabs that you're seeing here in the small pockets of white in the map on the left, many Palestinians were being displaced. There were actually two uprisings by the Palestinians against the British, and they were just crushed. The entire leadership, whatever governance and militia ability that the Palestinians had was crushed and dismantled. The leaders were exiled. So there was no governing ability in Palestine after the British crushed those rebellions. And Palestine was in disarray. The British wanted out. They were tired of this mandate period, and the Zionists wanted them out. There were actually at that time numerous terrorist attacks of the Zionists against the British. And the most notorious one was an attack on the headquarters of the British at the King David Hotel, and they planted a bunch of bombs and blew up a bunch of bombs there. 91 people were killed, and in fact, several years later, Menachem Begin, who was the prime minister of Israel from 1977 to 1983, and he was the head of the Zionist militant group called the Irgun. Back when these bombs were being placed, he boasted on American television that he was not only the father of terrorism in the Middle East, but in all the world. So this is what was going on at that time. And so the Brits wanted out. They handed the whole mess over to the UN, and the UN took it up. And they came up with two options. The first being a single democratic state where there were equal rights and votes for all. Seems kind of natural and normal, maybe. But with the Holocaust, with the guilt of the Holocaust kind of overshadowing all of the world at the time, it was just, all of us understand what a horrific thing that was. It was felt that this would disadvantage the Zionists. A single democratic state would disadvantage the Zionists because they were outnumbered by more than two to one in this region. So they considered a second option, which is the one we see shown in the map on the right, and that was the creation of a new state, a state of Israel, and it was obviously just replacing what used to be considered Palestine by a new state called Israel. And so the land that had been lived on for Palestinians for hundreds of years was going to be handed over to a new group of people, Israel. So let's take a closer look at that. So the land was going to go from, on the map on the left, we see a 5.8% to almost 10 times that. Literally over half of that landmass was going to be handed over to Israel. As far as the population distribution, so the way they laid this out, you see the numbers in the box on the right there, that the white regions would basically be 98% of the Jews would be living in those areas. But at the same time, there were also 438,000 Palestinians who still lived in those lands that were being handed over to Israel. And then the Palestinians were to be given these three green areas here, which we recognize as much larger areas of what's called the West Bank now, and the Gaza Strip, and even a little region to the north there. So basically what happened, how it was settled out, was Zionists were lobbying intensely with the UN, and they were victorious in that, and the UN adopted the two-state solution. But what happened was that the Palestinians rejected it, because for them it was like, wait a second, how did we go from the map on the left to the map on the right? This is not fair. You're just basically taking our ancestral homes and handing them over to some immigrants. So they rejected it. And this is where we get to the real crux of the matter, what's called the Nakba, which we'll hear about in our video coming up, and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. So the Zionist leaders welcomed the recognition of their state, and they also welcomed the rejection by the Palestinians of its boundaries. This allowed them to kind of have their cake and eat it too. Meticulous historical records document that at that point, Zionist militias proceeded to take not just 56% of the land, but 78% of the land in a campaign of ethnic cleansing. They methodically depopulated 400 villages, and it kind of looked like this. All of this is being taken from Ilan Pappy's book on the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Israeli soldiers entered the village and proceeded to do two things. They gathered all the villagers into the town square and separated out all the males from age 10 to 50, considered to be capable of fighting, and imprisoned them, often murdering some number in this group, depending on how much resistance was offered, and if any Israeli soldier had been wounded or killed in the process. Infants, the elderly, and the women and children were then simply driven off. They were provided no refuge whatsoever, simply driven off with only what they could carry. And these were the lucky ones. The second thing they did was they systematically dynamited all the homes in the village. It was not unusual for the charges to be set off while entire families were still in the house. The purpose for this was to ensure that the family would never be able to return. So in this way, 726,000 Palestinians became refugees, many in Gaza, but all over the place, really. And by the way, still no Palestinian state. This continued to get worse and worse until you see the map on the right, which is out of date already, as the West Bank is just disappearing with more settlements, and we all know what's happening in Gaza. I'm going to show one more slide quickly, next slide, that shows the map on the right shows all the red dots are all the villages, Palestinian villages that were depopulated. The map on the left shows some of the routes and endpoints of where the Palestinians ended up. And as you can see, many of them ended up in the surrounding countries, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and then some of them stayed internal, ended up in the West Bank or Gaza. Okay, so next we're going to go into parallels, but before we do that, we have a brief audio clip that we were able to get from my good friend Arwa, who is a Palestinian, and she's just to introduce that, I tried another Palestinian friend, and just everybody should be aware in terms of allyship that Palestinians are going through intense trauma, just trauma beyond words. So for them to come to us and speak about it, I don't know if you can imagine what that would feel like to just speak about your trauma in the open and just talk about it for people who don't know about it, but it's very difficult for them. So Arwa told me that she recorded this 15 or more times, and but anyway, this is what she recorded, and just go ahead and play it. Gabe, please.
Hi, my name is Arwa, and I am an American Palestinian, and I want to share with you my feelings about and my thoughts about what's happening in Palestine and Gaza now. I just feel like we are the only people in the world that we have to prove constantly to the world that we live, we exist, and when we die, we have to also still prove to the world that we live, that we died. We have been trying to prove to the world that we have lived and existed in Palestine, and Palestine was never an empty land. And now, when we die, we still have to prove to the world that we died, that our numbers are accurate. Like nowadays, when more than 23,000 people, and mainly women and our children, have been brutally murdered in Gaza in this unjust genocidal war, and then when this number is shared with the world, we still hear voices that are saying, but how do we know those numbers are true? It's simply true because we as humans, we are telling you that this happened. These are our friends, our family members, our friends' family members. And those numbers are not an exaggeration. My friend yesterday, she was just telling me she lost more than 45 members from her family. This has been happening to the Palestinians for more than 75 years. But now it's just like, it's the people have no excuse because they know, they have seen, they have heard those videos. This unjust war has to stop. It's on us, on people. And I want to tell you, when I say us as people, I'm talking about us as humans with all religions. It is so not true when now it's widely spread like this is a religious war, Muslims and Jews. No, that's completely not true. I'm telling you about my family, about my grandparents. They have lived together as neighbors. They were Jews, they were Christians, they were neighbors, they trusted each other. They trusted each other with their children. When they would leave and go shop, do something, they will trust each other with their own children, like they will to babysit. So there was no problem. What is happening nowadays, this is what is like the result of the Zionism, this occupation that is even harming the Jewish people, harming Muslims, harming everyone with this unjust war. Now everyone knows what is happening. It is really on us. This is really our job as humans. We have to come together and first end this war, work our best to end this war, then end this occupation. It is on us, people. It is us, the humans, that we have to end this. Thank you.
I hope everyone can take a deep breath and ponder Arwa's words. From here, we'll go to our parallels to Native American history, and I'm very happy to introduce our Director of Education, Deirdre Encarnacion.
Thank you, and that was really powerful. So I do feel like we should all just take a moment to let that sink in, what we just heard. So thank you all for attending our program tonight. The situation that Native Americans experienced as European colonizers came into their lands is obviously not exactly the same as what is happening currently in Palestine. However, there are certain undeniable parallels, and I'll be discussing a few of these with you today. We're all familiar with the backstory of Native Americans and how their lands were taken. There may be some things that happened along that way that you might not be aware of that are sort of similar to this current situation. And also part of why we're talking about this is just keep in mind your own sort of thoughts and opinions of what happened to the Native Americans in your own country where we all live. And use that as sort of a template or a backdrop or however you will to juxtapose that against what you know about the current events happening in Palestine and Israel. So throughout this, I'll be sort of discussing the Native American aspect and then comparing it to the Palestinian. So the first thing I'm talking about is the doctrine of discovery. And this was basically an actual legal international law that allowed nations to acquire rights on any land that they quote unquote discovered. And this was legit. This was how they legitimized colonization of lands outside of Europe. And basically, what was the defining feature of how you could claim land as your own is if the land was not populated by Christians. So it was driven by Christianity, but it was actually a political and economic law. And similar to that, we see this biblical justification in Palestine. And we've already mentioned Menachem Begin as former Prime Minister of Israel. And this is a quote: "The Jewish people have unchallengeable, eternal, historic right to the land of Israel." Keeping in mind that Israel is the name that they chose for their country. It was not referred to as Israel before that, other than biblically. And there are basically blueprints for this in Genesis, Deuteronomy, Joshua, that are pulled up now and used as a current justification, saying that Israelites have this divine entitlement to the land. This is a map done by a cartographer, a map maker named Aaron Carapella, who is of Native American descent. And when you look at this, there is no blank space except where people basically can't live. There were hundreds of tribal nations prior to European contact. So to say that Europeans came in here and it was just this open land that was all accessible is not true. Someone lived everywhere, wherever you lived, wherever you are now in our country. Native tribe either lived there, used it for resources, gathered things there, but I promise you, someone lived there. And this is similar to our tribal groups in Palestine. This map is labeled the map to illustrate Syria and Palestine during the Middle Ages, according to the descriptions of Arab geographers. And you see, again, there's no blank space. Tribal groups lived there everywhere, generally Bedouin in nature, and they were semi-nomadic, and then we find them more settled now in the same place in villages. But genetic studies reveal that the modern Palestinians share genetic continuity with Bronze Age populations. So that goes back 3,000-4,000 years at least. And that's a National Geographic genetic study. When Native American people resisted the invasions, resisted loss of land, fought back for their rights, they were basically demonized, portrayed as savages, somehow not human, and that would further justify seizure and colonization of their land. And again, you see that in Palestine. And even the term Palestine is said, some people will say, well, that comes from the term Philistines. And we don't hear the term Philistine in a complimentary sense. When you call someone a Philistine, you don't mean it as a compliment. That's people who come in, they take your things, and they make it seem as if the people that have lived there for thousands of years somehow don't have a right to it, that wasn't their home. So it's a similar parallel there. Since when you're saying the Native Americans are less than human and don't have a right to that land, especially when you think of this doctrine of discovery, the colonization of the Americas was basically under the guise as converting Native people to Christianity, this search to save their souls. But the reality was a political and economic endeavor. And referring to the conquistadors, it's been written that it's idle to ask whether they were motivated more by greed or by religious zeal, because really the two go together. Again, early Zionism, as we heard earlier, focused on creating a separate political and economic homeland intended for the Jewish people primarily of European descent, not for people living there at the time. And this is, again, a quote from 1895, so this isn't a new ideology. I'm not going to read all of it, but basically it refers to getting the people out by procuring employment for them in other countries while denying the people employment in our own country, and basically driving everyone out. The property owners will come over to our side. In other words, people who own property there, people who had wealth, were welcome to stay. So now I'm going to compare that loss of territory. We already saw the maps, I know, but this will be San Diego. This is our Kumeyaay Nation here. And you can see their territory spanned from basically Oceanside, San Luis River sort of area, across down into what's now the Salton Sea, down into Baja California. It was massive territory. And what they have left now in their reservations are just these little colored dots that you see. And that's similar to this. Regarding military and weaponry, basically in both cases, the colonizing forces were just no match for the locals. What people probably it's not common knowledge, but in California, there was an actual government fund set aside, especially shortly after it became a state when you have the gold rush. The fund was for militias to go in and raid Native American villages and wipe them out. Not forced movements, because they would just be going onto more land that the settlers wanted. I'm talking actually massacres. The first governor of California, in his second State of the State address, stated that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. We cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or wisdom of man to avert. So this was state funded. And we see this in Palestine as well, as Steve mentioned, where you have villages just wiped out. This particular description is from an Israeli soldier who took part in one of these raids. And his quote is, they were throwing grenades and blowing up houses. His quote is, "I won't tell you that we were there with kids' glove on. House after house. We're putting in explosives and they're running away. An explosion and move on, an explosion and move on. And within a few hours, half the village isn't there anymore." This particular event had a profound demographic and political effect, because this led to just a mass flight of Arabs, Palestinian Arabs, from their homes. Another one of the parallels that we see is this criminalization of identity. It becomes a crime simply to be who you are. In California, what we saw, and probably other states too, but I'm more knowledgeable in California, because it was it was Spain, part of Spain, then it was part of Mexico. So by the time it became a part of America, a lot of Native Americans had adopted a Hispanic or Mexican sort of persona or identity to avoid being subject to these laws and economic oppression that Native Americans faced. So they might be Native people at home, but when they were out, they had to act as if they were Hispanic. There were Indian adoption laws that basically, if you saw a child you felt was being neglected of Native American descent, you could just adopt that child into your family. This was not because people were kind-hearted and wanted to save the children. This was a way of bringing servants into your house. I will be talking about it in a moment, but the same thing is happening in a different way in Palestine, where being of Palestinian descent makes you subject to arrest with no charge. When I was in college, I did not know I knew Israel was a country. I had no idea about how it was founded or what the situation was until I had a friend who was from Jordan. We all knew him as being from Jordan. And then one day he was just sort of telling us how he was talking to his mom about what they were learning at school, and he said they were studying the Holocaust, and she slapped him because to her, the Holocaust and the Eastern European Jews is what spurred so much of this, giving their land to Israel. They were actually Palestinian, but they had to flee to Jordan and spend some time there before they came to the United States. And they still sort of reflected being Jordanian because of that trauma, that if they just didn't say they were Palestinian, if they said they were from Jordan, it would just put some distance between that. But it still obviously was strong. There is a similarity in human rights violations between what happened, especially in California, to Native American people and what's happening in Palestine now. There were laws on the books in the state of California enforced. They were called Indian vagrancy laws. These were unemployment laws that resulted in servitude. So basically, Indians were required to have a job, to work. And if you were to see a Native American person idle, let's say you went into a store and stood outside for a minute, that would be considered idle. You can grab them, take them to the local jail, and then petition to have them as your servant. So again, there were all these laws on the books that allowed you to grab a Native American, either child or adult, and force them into servitude. It's a slightly different situation in Palestine, but nonetheless, there is this incarceration, these current human rights violations. And these are based on Israel's own prison figures, showing that out of a total of at least over 10,000 Palestinians in Israeli custody, nearly 40% of them are being held without charge. And many of those are accused of nonviolent offenses. Many of those are minors. As of December 3rd, 2023, almost 3,000 Palestinians were being held in Israel as administrative detainees, which means they can be held without charge indefinitely. More than 1,500 of those arrests were made in November alone. 1,500 people arrested in 1 month. And these figures are from an Israeli nonprofit that offers legal aids to Palestinians, and it draws directly from Israel's prison service. So there's no doubt to the accuracy. If anything, the numbers are probably more that aren't being documented. So the last thing I'm going to talk about tonight are these acts of individual resiliency. For the Native Americans, the person I look to is Ishi. Ishi just means man or human in his language, because you weren't allowed to really say your name to people, and he had no one left to say his name for him. He was basically cornered and chased down by dogs up in Northern California. He was the last of his tribe. Everyone had been massacred, and somehow he survived. So he ended up living in an anthropology museum for the last 4 years of his life. But even while he was there, he continued to make tools. He would go hunt in the hills in San Francisco. That individual, he would not stop being who he was. And in Palestine, this story, maybe some of you have heard of Ahed Tamimi. I'm sure I'm saying her name wrong, and I'm sorry. She recently published a book, so if you're interested in learning more about it. But ever since she was a very young girl, everyone really, right, not just her, but she felt the need to resist this oppression, to resist Israeli soldiers coming into her house, her cousin blasted in the face with tear gas, her brother shot. So her quote is, "Even though I was a child, I understood that my life had to be devoted to a cause greater than myself. My parents instilled the notion in me and my brothers that if we didn't do anything to benefit our homeland, then we didn't do anything to benefit ourselves. If I was successful in life, but my success didn't help Palestine, then it wasn't truly a success." Collective acts of resiliency here in San Diego, the Kumeyaay were documented as the most relentless or restless, stubborn, haughty, warlike, and hostile towards us. There were no conversions in the first year of the mission. That didn't happen in any other mission throughout Baja California or California. And in fact, the Kumeyaay organized a rebellion and attack with warriors from at least 40 villages. They used flaming arrows to burn what were then the thatched roofs on the mission buildings. Moving forward, when you see the clay tiles in the mission architecture, that was in large part because the clay tiles were more resistant to flaming arrows. So another term of acts of resistance is art. So again, back to the Kumeyaay, among the work that they had to do at the missions was tile and brick making. And archaeologists have found that floor tiles around the altar were actually etched with native Kumeyaay imagery related to cosmology and their creator. And one such floor tile was observed front and center in front of the altar. So even though it looked like the people were being brought in and praying at the altar, a Christian altar, the reality is they had designed the floor with their own images, and they were praying to their own creator. And that is an act of resistance through art, just right under the nose of your oppressors. So some of the acts of resistance art in Palestine, there's a lot of street art. There's the West Bank wall, that's also known as the Wall of Shame. And this is the guard tower, or depiction of that guard tower. Visit historic Palestine. The Israeli army liked it so much, they never left. And that particular wall is not only depicted in a lot of artworks, but it's also a place where people depict art. This particular artist, and this also sort of depicts that tie-in of Israel and the United States. He's been arrested multiple times, and he says, that he was told by a soldier, our bullets stop on the body, but the effect of your brush travels all over the world, so it's a dangerous tool. The British street art artist Banksy also has been doing street art in Palestine since the mid-2000s. And this is thought to be done by Banksy. And it says, if we wash our hands of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless, we side with the powerful. We don't remain neutral. And that's written on the wall of destroyed homes in northern Gaza. So that's what I have for you tonight. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much, Deirdre. So now we're going to see a video from Rabbi Alexis Pierce, who is a member of the PB Interfaith group and an activist for Jewish Voice for Peace.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for including me in your program. My name is Rabbi Alexis Pierce. Steve asked me to record a couple of minutes about my background as a Jewish person and my reaction to what's happening now in Gaza. I've lived here in San Diego almost 30 years. I grew up in Los Angeles in a Jewish family that belonged to a synagogue. We kept kosher and attended services occasionally. All of my 4 grandparents were traditional Jews from Eastern Europe. My dad said Anatevka in the Fiddler on the Roof film was just like his father's village. They all came here due to persecution of Jews by the Russian government that had an explicit policy to kill, starve, and drive out the Jews. I went to Hebrew school at our synagogue 3 days a week after school and had a bat mitzvah when I was 13, which at that time was somewhat new for girls. I became interested in religion because I was a spiritual person, and the religious youth groups and summer camps I attended were fun and interesting. I belonged to a couple of Zionist youth groups too, which were more or less just like my synagogue youth group as far as singing and camping and study and religious practice. I was taught that Israel was a wonderful new country that was making the desert bloom, that was full of idealistic and courageous young people who were building a place for Jews to be safe from anti-Semitism. I also grew up with Holocaust stories. The Holocaust took place only about 20 years before I was born. My father was in the army in World War II. And as you know, the Holocaust killed 6 million of Europe's Jews. I remember my parents' great excitement during the Six-Day War in 1968 when Israel took over East Jerusalem and the West Bank and the Sinai. They were thrilled that Israel had survived, that it had doubled in size. Back then, I thought Zionism simply meant that there should be a country for Jews. Supporting Israel was a usual part of our religious services and communal events. We learned Hebrew with the modern Israeli dialect, different from the Yiddish dialect my parents were brought up with. We sang Israeli songs. We had Israeli poems as part of our prayer services. We learned about Israel in Hebrew school along with Jewish holidays and customs, like it was just part of the religion. In Hebrew school classrooms, there was a map of Israel on the wall across from the chart of Hebrew letters we were learning. There were American and Israeli flags on the corners of the pulpit, what we call the bima. I took all this completely for granted. I visited Israel with my family in the early 70s, and it was like a Jewish historical museum and pride festival. We saw ancient relics and the modern kibbutz, monuments to the Holocaust, growing cities, and many locations that had only been Bible place names to us before. It was fun. At that time, to me, in the early 70s, Palestinians were just terrorists and hijackers of planes, and I had no idea what their story was. Fast forward to the late 1980s when I decided to become a rabbi, and the door had just been opened to women to do that. Part of the seminary program involved spending time in Israel. It was the Intifada now, and the old city of Jerusalem was a ghost town of shuttered shops, a stark contrast to the bustling market right out of Raiders of the Lost Ark that I had visited with my family in the 70s. I had occasion at that time to meet and talk with some Arabs in Jerusalem and to hear their stories for the first time. I was really surprised and very ashamed to learn how so many had been forced from their homes and made into refugees and second-class citizens when Israel became a country. I didn't want to hear it and minimized and rationalized it in my mind. I had been taught Israel extended equality to Arabs, but I witnessed Israeli Jews who despised and feared Arabs and also disparaged non-Orthodox Jewish practice. As a woman rabbinical student in a progressive American Jewish movement, I was ridiculous to those people. And I learned about how religious parties, Jewish religious parties, already had a political presence in every ministry of the government. You couldn't get married or buried or open a restaurant without Orthodox religious authority to oversee matters. There was a feminist group called Women at the Wall that I joined with, who were trying to gain the right for women to worship in public at the Western Wall and facing stiff and violent opposition from some Orthodox groups who found our practice offensive. I also joined with Women in Black, who stood together every Friday to protest the occupation. I was also surprised to learn about Arab Jews, the Sephardic community, many of whom had been driven to Israel after the Israeli War for Independence by the Arab countries where they had lived for centuries in peace because they opposed the state of Israel. Their countries opposed the state of Israel and sent away their Jews. And in Israel, they were considered lower class than the European-descended Ashkenazi Jews like me, who tended to have higher status there. The Black Jews, who had been rescued from famine and brought to Israel from Ethiopia, had even lower status. I had not realized these categories existed among Jews. So it was not the socialist utopia I had grown up believing in and singing about and marching for. As a feminist, as an American believer in the separation of church and state, as a Star Trek fan who envisioned a race-blind future, Israel began to look very problematic. After I came to San Diego to head a small congregation called Congregation Dor Chadash in the mid-1990s, I was approached by a Jewish-Palestinian dialogue group who wanted to make a presentation to my community. I met with them and liked them and arranged for the event. My congregants mostly appreciated it, and I joined a dialogue group myself, who were mostly American and Israeli Jews and Arabs, Palestinian Arabs and others. Now I really began to hear their stories in detail and in first person. I started to feel like my house was burning down. Much that I had been taught, I began to realize, was sheer propaganda, crafted to excuse Israeli aggression and to raise money and support for Israel by neglecting to mention the truth. My friend Rabbi Brent Rosen describes that truth like this. When Israel was founded in the traumatic wake of the Holocaust to create safety and security for the Jewish people, it was a state founded on the backs of another people. Israel was established through what the Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, the catastrophe, the ethnic cleansing of 750,000 Palestinians from their homes in 1948, who mostly became refugees. And since that time, Israel has subjected the Palestinians to a regime of Jewish supremacy in order to maintain its demographic majority in the land. I had been taught to see Palestinians as terrorists and Jew haters. Now I started to see them as people, like the Jews, who had been persecuted and driven from their home of many hundreds of years just because they were not Jews. And as the Israeli government drifted rightward, these policies became more obvious and more ugly to me. It was becoming an apartheid state, especially in the occupied territories. I took the flags off the bima. I started to see that Jewish religion had existed long before the modern state of Israel and was not best represented by it. I tried to peel apart support for the state of Israel from my religious practice that emphasized peace and justice as ideals. For this and other reasons, I left congregational work and then became a healthcare chaplain serving the general population, not just Jews. I began to support progressive Jewish groups that were interested in dialogue and justice for the Palestinians, including Jewish Voice for Peace and recently Rabbis for Ceasefire. My friend Rabbi Brent Rosen, I mentioned before, founded a new synagogue in Chicago that was explicitly non-Zionist. I followed this with interest, finally joining it during the pandemic when they developed a large Zoom following. We've since become explicitly anti-Zionist. This is a first, but I hope it's a trend. Working in the general community, I saw that most Jews do not belong to synagogues, and many do not feel good about Israel. However, the synagogues and the Jewish federations, which are social service and charitable organizations, continued to proclaim steadfast support for Israel no matter what, as if our lives depended on it, as if any voice that spoke against Israel's policies for the Palestinians was expressing hatred of Jews. I can't fault people who lived through the Holocaust for worrying that there are enemies who want to kill all the Jews. I've been exposed to enough material from white supremacist hate groups to know that there are such people, and there are such people among the Arabs too. But this fear should not be used to give the government of Israel permission to abuse the rights of others, to take their land, to attack and kill them, to imprison and humiliate them, and to act offended when they protest or fight back. The fact that we've been subject to so much persecution over the centuries should make us all the more reluctant to inflict persecution. So for me, Zionism has become something I cannot support. I don't see Israel as my country. It doesn't make me feel safe or proud. What I hope for there is a country that provides equal rights and equal status to all its citizens, even if that state is not called Israel, and even if the majority there are not Jews. There should be freedom of religion and full equality for women. Those are my values, but I don't live there. I am not directly affected by this situation, and I don't feel like it's my place to tell Israel what it should do. But I see this recent massacre in Gaza as the clearest evidence yet that Zionism is the wrongful domination by one group over another. I don't want the United States to support this, and I'm upset that the US has made Israel more or less its military base in the region. I realize these things are not decided on the basis of right, but on the basis of power and money and politics. So at the very least, I want to call it what it really is and not pretend America supports Israel because of some kind of idealism about democracy. The 25 million Christian Zionists in America who support Israel also frighten me with their hope of seeing a second coming, which would mean the end of all Jews. I'm pessimistic about the Israeli government changing. I know there are many wonderful peace and justice activists in Israel marching in the streets, even among Holocaust survivors who demand justice for Palestine and want to see things change for the better. But they haven't been able to get quite enough of a following to take control. So I follow what's going on there, but from a distance. It's not personal to me like it once was. I don't know how to conclude except to say that I hope the day comes when we see a generation of new leaders who believe in justice and equality and freedom and can find a way to repair the damage caused by all this hateful, genocidal violence. There will have to be rebuilt trust. There will have to be renewal of hope. And what's going on now seems to me to be driving that day farther off into the future. But I pray it will come.
That was very powerful, so informative. Listening to Rabbi Pierce. I hope you enjoyed her talk and found it inspiring. I'm going to close briefly with some takeaways for our holistic allyship. I want to say, first of all, that just say unequivocally that the annihilation of Gaza with indiscriminate shelling and the massacre of tens of thousands of civilians is not the solution for a peaceful Israel. And based on what we have learned and heard about in terms of militant Zionism, that it may be the only solution for the maintenance of a Jewish supremacist Zionist state. Resistance, as long as that's still the case, resistance will continue. So this has been mostly about among the three tiers of allyship that we talked about: awareness, connection, and solidarity. This has been just a glimpse, a 1 hour glimpse of awareness. To be allies, our awareness is key. So I encourage us all to keep reading and keep listening to Palestinian voices. So as far as resources, just real briefly, what we utilized tonight, the book by Ilan Pappy, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, Jewish Voice for Peace. They're all over Instagram, website. They have a website. Check them out and follow them, and you'll be very well informed. They're doing amazing work. Just today, they staged a sit-in at the UN, protesting the U.S.'s vetoing the votes for a ceasefire. Also, there's, in terms of meeting Palestinians, there's the House of Palestine at Balboa Park. And we're going to email out a follow-up to this that'll give you more resources. It's our responsibility to become aware. It's not the Palestinians' responsibility to make us aware. It's our responsibility to become aware. So another lesson about allyship is that we can consider, in our own context, who is responsible for dismantling systems of injustice. And it is those who are beneficiaries of those systems. So Jewish Voice for Peace is kind of leading the way in terms of, they're not the marginalized. They're on the side of the upper hand of the power dynamic, and they're showing us a fantastic example of allyship with all the work that they're doing. They're doing a lot of stuff here in San Diego, so just look them up and sign up for their newsletter and take part in their activities. And finally, I'd like us, in the blending between our own history here in this region and the history in Palestine, to keep in mind the need for the same sort of allyship that Jewish Voice for Peace is showing us for Palestine. We need that same sort of allyship here in this region, in the San Diego, Tijuana, Kumeyaay region. It was literally less than 2 generations in the late 1800s compared to 1950, 1948, that the same sort of things were happening right here in California. So please keep that in mind and let that be a seed planted that grows in terms of what we can do here in our own region to make things more equitable for the Native peoples of this region. And we will be having future awareness events about that. So please keep us in mind. We have a newsletter that will keep you informed of our upcoming events. And yeah, please go ahead and follow us. One last slide. Thank you everyone for coming. Here's our website, and we're on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. So please follow us, and we really appreciate everyone being here. Again, this is recorded, and we'll provide a link to it, and you can share it with your friends. Thank you everyone for being here. Sorry we ran over just a little bit, and we wish everyone a good night. Thank you.